Jaya Shriman Narayana. Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna. Jaya Shri Guru. Sanatana Dharma Jayate. Dharmarashtra Jayate. Suryavangsha Jayate. Om Hri Om. Namaste everyone. Welcome to the ISDS live stream. It is absolutely wonderful to be here with you today on this Monday. If you will please allow me to just take care of a little thing here very quickly. Could you do me a favor? Could you turn the fan down just one notch? Just because it's making noise a little bit. I don't want it to disturb the live stream. That one. Very good. Thank you very much. Very good. It's very hot here in Omaha today. I forget what the temperature is, but it's extremely hot. So we have a fan going, but it was making a little bit of noise. And I don't want it to disturb what we're doing here in any way. Well, again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And just a few very quick things that I want to say before we proceed, before we begin. First of all, if you have not yet done so, please visit our website, dharmacentral.com. That is the website of the International Sanatana Dharma Society. And that is the movement that is presenting this live stream to you every week. The other thing is just a little bit of news. As people know, we are awaiting the publication of our latest book, which is called Principles of Perfect Leadership. And let me tell you that as of right now, the book will be available extremely soon. It will be available for purchase this week. The book took a long time only because the people who put it together were exceedingly busy for the last month or so, something like that. Otherwise, it would have come out a little bit sooner. But otherwise, the book is 100% ready. It has been uploaded to Amazon, and it will be available both in print edition as well as an ebook as well. So again, that will be ready within hopefully days. And when it is, we will certainly announce the URL. And next Monday, I will let everyone know about the book and that it is indeed available, where they can purchase it, etc. So very good news. Our very next book, Principles of Perfect Leadership, will be available hopefully within days from today. So, all that being said, now we're going to go on to the talk for today. And this is a very unique talk, actually. This is something that, interestingly, I had the title of for about 6 years, something like that. Because I knew that I wanted to do this talk. I had the title, I knew which verses I wanted to discuss. And this talk is called The God of Patanjali. And what we're going to be speaking about is exactly that. What is Patanjali's view on the nature of God? Who does he say that God is? What is the divine ontology in accordance with the great sage Patanjali? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And exclusively, we will be looking at his words in his most famous work, his most famous text, and that is the Yoga Sutras. Now, Patanjali wrote several texts, actually, not just the Yoga Sutras. There are several different things that he wrote. But this is certainly the most famous of his texts throughout the world, actually, both in South Asia, but also in the West as well. And before we dive into looking at these verses, and for those who don't know, the verses are available if you look at the description of this video, and these are all my translations. They're not anyone else's translations. These are my translations of the Yoga Sutras. I've been slowly translating the Yoga Sutras with the idea of eventually creating a commentary on the Yoga Sutras and having that be a published work. I've actually done lectures, series of classes on the Yoga Sutras several times, and those are all recorded. But I will be at some point doing that again, maybe even online, actually. But if you want to see the verses, you can look at them in the description of this video. But in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit about who is Patanjali and why this topic is of such importance. First of all, again, many people are familiar with Patanjali. Maybe not as many people as are familiar with Bhagavad Gita, but pretty close. Indeed, in the West especially, for individuals who practice yoga, for individuals who go to yoga classes at yoga centers, ashrams, etc., it is often the case that people will eventually study the Yoga Sutras. Now, of course, what is very unfortunate is that despite the fact that people indeed study the Yoga Sutras, which is a wonderful thing, you'll have yogis, you'll have American yogis, European yogis, who will go to some yoga center. They will maybe even do yoga teacher training. And at some point, they will study the Yoga Sutras. That is a wonderful thing in and of itself. The unfortunate thing, however, is that, of course, there tends to be a lot of misunderstanding as far as what Patanjali is actually teaching in the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras is not a straightforward book. It's not a matter of simply reading it the way you would read a magazine or a newspaper or even any other book. The Yoga Sutras, as is true for all sutra literature, is not designed to be understood merely at a glance, at a first reading. In fact, not even at a 10th reading, not even at a 1,000th reading. Now, having said all this, a person might become a little discouraged and start to question, well, if you can't even understand this book after a 1,000th reading, then what's the purpose of the book even existing? Well, it's not so much the number of times that a person reads the book. It is how you read the book and with whom you read the book. The way that we understand, especially the sutra literature, of course, by extension, this is true for all the Vedic literature, but especially the sutra literature, which is very terse in form. It's almost like code. In fact, it is indeed code, but in Sanskrit. The way that we study this literature and understand it is exclusively by understanding it at the feet of a guru, by studying with someone who understands the code perfectly and more who is living the code. This is how we understand the Yoga Sutras and any other sutras. Now, all this being the case, of course, for many people, many Westerners, many people in South Asia, many people today, because there are not many qualified gurus to go through the Yoga Sutras with, again, there is a lot of misunderstanding as far as what the Yoga Sutras are actually saying. For myself, I am, and I say this very humbly, I'm an expert on the Yoga Sutras. I understand every single sutra perfectly. I have read almost, I don't want to say every translation because there are quite a few, all of the major translations in English. I have read many of the commentaries, many of the traditional commentaries on the Yoga Sutras. And again, it always, of course, pains my heart when I see people reading the Yoga Sutras, even commenting on the Yoga Sutras, even having websites dedicated to the Yoga Sutras, and they get the very basics wrong of what Patanjali is actually saying. Now, all this as preface, now we come to very specifically why it is that we are discussing this one specific topic, and that is the God of Patanjali. This is one of the areas where, unfortunately, many people misunderstand exactly what it is that Patanjali is actually saying about the nature of God. Now, what's sad about this is that Patanjali is indeed extremely clear. And it's amazing how this is one of these truths that is in your face and yet you're blinded to it. So it's an amazing thing. Patanjali, is very, very clear about what is his view on what is the nature of God. There's no mystery or anything like this. And indeed, when we go through these sutras, you'll see that that is the case. Now, who exactly is Patanjali? We have to begin with this. Very important. We have to begin with the author of the text. You know, there's a debate in the study of literature as far as, do you need to really understand the author to understand the text? Some people say yes, some people say no. Well, the answer is yes. The answer is yes, because the text did not arise ex nihilo, out of nothingness. It arose from a person, from an actual living being, from a personality. That being the case, it's important to understand who is Patanjali. Well, let us understand this. Patanjali himself is an individual who is an incarnation of Anantashesha, of a divine being. And who is Anantashesha? Anantashesha is, as I said, a divine being. He is one of the Shaktis of God. Interestingly, even though he's male, most Shaktis tend to be female, but this is an exception to this case. And what he represents very specifically for God is God's power of infinity. This is who Patanjali is. There is no debate about this. Anyone who is a traditional Hindu, who is Vedic, any person who has done traditional commentaries on the Yoga Sutras, they all explain this, they all understand this. This is the understanding, and always has been. He is Anantashesha, and he also serves as, one could say, the resting place for Vishnu himself. He is a devotee of Vishnu. This is who Anantashesha is. And very specifically, Anantashesha decided to come upon the earth in order to teach pure and authentic yoga. Indeed, Patanjali, Pat and Anjali. I've told this story a few times, but what does his name even mean? Well, making the story very short, Patanjali's mother was someone who, for some reason, could not have children, and she was praying to God, and she was in Anjali Mudra at the time, and she was praying to God, please God, give me a child. Due to her sincerity at that time, Pat means to fall, and Anjali is the mudra. It is said that Patanjali fell from the heavens into her hands, and that is how he was born. That is how this divine being was born upon the earth. And this is the most important thing to understand, is that, again, there is no debate about this. There is no one who is a traditional Vedic individual, who is a Vedic scholar, etc., who will disagree with this. Patanjali, of necessity, was a Vaishnava. By default, he was a Vaishnava because of who he was. Again, he was the incarnation of one of the powers of Vishnu himself, of Anantashesha. That being the case, it's always been understood traditionally, again, not New Age circles, not your pal who started practicing yoga 3 years ago. No, we're talking about traditional Vedic scholars going back thousands and thousands and thousands of years who wrote in Sanskrit. There is common agreement. Everyone understands that, yes, Patanjali was a Vaishnava. He was a devotee of Vishnu. Now, with all this background, now we can look at the actual words of Patanjali himself. And again, this is my translation, no one else's. We are going to begin with Pada 1, that is what we would commonly call Chapter 1, and Sutra 23. And I'm going to skip the Sanskrit unless I have to refer to it, and I will simply read the verses. So, Chapter 1, Sutra 23 proceeds in this way. Or else, one can achieve samadhi through the process of devotion to the Supreme Lord. Ishvara pranidhana is the actual term for this. Ishvara pranidhana, that is devotion to God. Now, let's look at this verse a little bit and unpack exactly what it's saying here. So first of all, it starts in an odd way, or else. So we can see by this construction, and if you read the Yoga Sutras, easily you see this, you can see that this is a continuation of a thought in which Patanjali, previous to this verse, was talking about the nature of samadhi and how to achieve samadhi. So now he is saying, or else, in other words, this is another important way in which one can achieve samadhi. one can achieve samadhi, and now let's stop there for a moment. And we're going to comment on this word, samadhi. A very, very important word that we find especially in the yoga literature, but we actually find this in many places. We find this word, as far as the larger texts, almost everywhere, in all the Puranas, etc. And it's a word that has been translated variously by various people when they translate the word, and we'll just stick with English very specifically. When it's translated into English, often it's mistranslated. Indeed, I've seen the word samadhi translated as trance, for example, which is one of the worst translations, unfortunately, because whenever I hear of the word trance, it makes me think of some sort of psychic medium with a turban on, kind of trying to talk to the dead or something like this. That's not what samadhi means. Rather, very simply, samadhi, samadhi. Sama, equipoised, same, level, etc. Dhi, meaning intellect, mind substance, etc. So what samadhi very simply means is this state of being in which, having perfected meditation, one's awareness is now absorbed upon the object of one's meditation. And that object, of course, for true yogis, for serious yogis, is God. So this is what is meant by samadhi, first of all. So one can achieve samadhi through the process of devotion to the Supreme Lord. Now, we begin here, and again, this is my translation. If you look at other translations, they will be very similar to this. In other words, when it comes to the technical term, Ishvara pranidhana, which you find in very few places, actually, you certainly find it here in the Yoga Sutras, there's no debate about what it means. It means devotion to the Lord. Indeed, most translators will translate it that way because that is the actual meaning of the term, Ishvara pranidhana. So interestingly, Patanjali being a yogi, Patanjali being a very great scholar, a very great rishi, etc. Again, this is not the only book he wrote. He wrote several commentaries on various things. He wrote several other books, etc. It is important to note here that he is extolling devotion toward God. In other words, bhakti. He does not use the word bhakti specifically. And it's interesting how, for very technical reasons, indeed, not just with this term, Ishvara pranidhana, but with many terms, Patanjali uses his own very specific Sanskritic terms. And it's because he's seeking precision in explaining what is the philosophy and the psychology of yoga, very specifically. That being the case, the fact that he doesn't say bhakti specifically, it means nothing. Again, Ishvara pranidhana, that is the Sanskrit. It means devotion to God. And again, anyone who is a Sanskritist knows this. For that matter, he doesn't say Atman. He says drashtur, means the same thing. He doesn't say moksha, for liberation. He says kaivalya. So again, he uses his own very specific, very unique, but accurate and correct, indeed, hyper accurate, extremely accurate terminology because of what he's trying to communicate. So here, very specifically, again, he is saying that one of the processes in order to achieve samadhi is indeed devotion to, and then he uses a very specific word and name, a very specific designator for God. He says Ishvara, Ishvara. And that indeed can be translated, if you wanted to translate it as close to the Sanskrit as possible, it could be translated as the Supreme Lord. This is how I translated it, and that this is the most accurate translation of that term, Ishvara, in the English language. Now, what's the significance of this? We know that in Sanskrit, there are many, many different terms and names, two different things, many different terms and names for God. So, for example, we know that in Vedanta, very specifically, Brahman is the term that is used. And then, again, of course, very specific names, such as Vishnu, Narayana, and then talking about the avatars, Krishna, Rama, etc., Narasingha, so many different avatars. Well, it's significant that here he does not use a Vedantic term. Of course, he's not strictly speaking a Vedantist. He is He is teaching the school of yoga, of the Shadarshanas, of the 6 schools of Vedic philosophy. He is teaching yoga, so on the one hand, it's not radically surprising that he's using a different term, but at the same time, we have to take note of the deeper reason for why he's using a different term. Why he's not saying, on the one hand, Brahman, which is the more, let's say, impersonal, philosophical designation of the Supreme, but then he's not being radically personal either. He's not making it clear and just saying, Narayana. No, he's not being that clear either. Rather, he's kind of in the middle. He is indeed being personal, on the one hand, by pointing to God, not just the Supreme Absolute, again, in a more general way. No, Ishvara means the Supreme Lord. Now, the reason why this is important is because we need to understand that what Patanjali is explaining here is that, A, we achieve samadhi through devotion to that Supreme Lord, but also that Supreme Lord is precisely that, A, supreme, the highest of all. Not really, really great, really good, not 10th best, etc., etc. The supreme, but also the Supreme Lord. So in other words, God. What we in English would call God, very specifically. Because what does it mean? You see, if he were to say, let's say, and I'm just creating a construct here for the sake of argument. If he were to say, Brahman Pranidhana, devotion to Brahman, well, it's impossible to have devotion toward something that is impersonal. Rather, by default, of necessity, you must have devotion only toward, you can have devotion only toward a person, a personal being. So thus, this is why he uses the word Ishvara. So we see that the technical precision with which someone like Patanjali communicates, we need to take it seriously. We need to take it seriously. It's not a matter of just kind of taking a quick class with someone who they themselves, maybe they've been practicing, studying yoga for 5 or 10 years, etc. No, we have to take our time with these sutras, A, and B, we need to study with someone who is authorized to teach us these sutras. Otherwise, we bypass all of this. Otherwise, Ishvara Pranidhanadva. That's the full sutra. That's the full sutra. Very short. How quick would it be? How quickly did I say the Sanskrit? We could go through it very quickly, but we won't understand it. Rather, we need to take our time, and we need someone who is qualified to explain to us every single subtle sound of these sutras and what they mean. So thus, again, we begin with this, where Patanjali is explaining this process of devotion, and not just to anyone, but to Ishvara, to the Supreme Lord. Now, of course, this is by implication. It can be implied very logically so, with all the evidence I gave you earlier, that in Patanjali's mind, which would be a very beautiful place to be, in Patanjali's mind, when he is saying Ishvara, he is talking about Narayana. He is talking about Vishnu. And again, why? Well, because of who he is, because of the fact that he is indeed the incarnation of Anantashesha, because it is understood traditionally by all Vedic scholars, all gurus, all acharyas, bar none, it's understood that he is a Vaishnava himself. So thus we understand very easily that when he says Ishvara, he means Narayana. So now, that being said, let's go on to the very next sutra, which is, again, Pada 1 or Chapter 1. And this is now Sutra 24. And Patanjali continues. The Supreme Lord is a special and distinct self, purusha. Purusha is the Sanskrit for that. Who is unaffected by actions, the fruits of actions, or the latent impressions that cause such actions. This is a verse that is filled with meaning and with divine ontology, and which is equipped to help us to understand what is truly the nature of God. There is a lot that Patanjali is saying just with this one verse in explaining indeed what is God, what is the nature of God. Several things to be said here, and again, this will, the way I'm going to explain this now, again, even though it's very straightforward, many of the other translations also translate this in the same spirit in which Patanjali wrote this. Still, at the same time, many people I've seen will just kind of overlook this, and when asked, oh, what did Patanjali teach about the nature of God? They will say literally the opposite of what this verse just said. So this verse is crucial if we are to understand in an honest way, in an unadulterated way, what did Patanjali truly teach about the nature of God? So let's go through this. First of all, again, Ishvara is the very last word of this sutra. So again, Ishvara, the Supreme Lord, is a special and distinct self, purusha. This is the exact translation. Indeed, even individuals who are Advaitins or who don't even quite believe what Patanjali is saying here, I've seen that often they have no choice but to translate this verse in a similar sort of way because it's so straightforward. You can't play games with this verse. The Supreme Lord is a special and a distinct self. Now, this is in comparison to other selves. If you look at the previous verses, which we don't have time to now, you understand that earlier Patanjali was talking about how ultimately all beings are indeed these selves, purusha or drashtur, etc. Now, understanding that every living being ultimately, whatever the specific sort of body it is that they have at the present moment, whether they're human, whether they're a god, whether they're a dog, whether they're an elephant, whether they're anything, understanding that ultimately all beings are this divine self, this purusha, this atman. There are many terms for this. Now, Patanjali makes it very clear that within this infinite ocean of an unlimited number of atmans, there is one atman that is unlike the others and who is special, who is different. And that is God. That is the Supreme Lord. So thus he says here again very clearly, the Supreme Lord is a special and distinct self, distinct from all other atmans and more special, indeed, infinitely more special than all of the other atmans. And now he explains why. He talks about that Supreme Lord who is unaffected. Now let's stop there for a moment. This is one of the distinguishing characteristics between ourselves versus God. We are affected by that which is lower than us. We can be conditioned. Thus, we have the ability to fall under illusion. We have the ability to make mistakes, etc., etc., etc. There's actually a long list of things that we as finite atmans have the ability, negatively speaking, to experience and to do in comparison to God. God is unaffected by anything lower than him. God does not fall into illusion. God is not conditioned, etc., etc. And this is what distinguishes ourselves from God. And again, not to repeat, but it needs to be repeated because again, I'm someone who I've been studying this path from every angle and in every respect for 45 years, and I've heard it all. I have heard people say quite literally the opposite of what Patanjali just said here, where people, more New Age types, or again, a lot of American hippie types who are kind of playing with yoga and they don't really understand the Yoga Sutras, they don't have a real guru, they've never studied Sanskrit, etc. They will say, oh, what Patanjali teaches in the Yoga Sutras is that we are all the same, we are all God, that God is non-distinct from us, that we're all equal spiritually, blah, 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 blah. Well, here is Patanjali in, again, very clear Sanskrit, but also very clear English translation, saying the opposite, that no, we are not like God. God is not like us. God is our source. So qualitatively speaking, indeed, it is the case that God is consciousness, we are consciousness, etc. So there certainly are areas of linkage, areas of unity, but at the same time, we can never claim that we are God because God is unaffected by anything lower than God. This being the case, God does not fall into illusion, but we do. Now let's go on with these qualifiers. So that Supreme Lord who is unaffected by actions. And these are pretty straightforward, so we'll go through this somewhat quickly because we have many verses to look at. So God is unaffected by actions. So God acts. God does act. Indeed, Krishna says this in the Bhagavad Gita, that he himself acts, but he is unaffected. In other words, he has not only the supreme form of detachment, he is fully transcendent. Thus, what it means for God to act is nothing like what it means for us to act in any way. God does not act out of selfishness. God does not act out of fear, etc., 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 out of anger, out of lust, out of want, etc. So thus, God is unaffected by all actions that everyone else is doing and that even he is engaged in. So that's the first thing. He is also unaffected by the fruits of actions. In other words, unlike all the rest of us, when we act and then we want those fruits of our actions. In other words, what does this mean? Who has a job out there? Hopefully most of you, if not all of you. If you have a job, imagine going to your job and it's 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and it's a tough job, either intellectually or physically. And you go to your job and after 2 weeks, the boss says to you, "Oh, thank you so much." And you ask, "Oh, great, where's my paycheck?" "Oh, no paycheck. We thought you were just doing this for the love of doing it." It doesn't matter who you are and how spiritual you claim to be. You're going to be upset. You're going to be upset. Why? Because people act for the fruit of those actions. But not God. Not God. God acts at all times out of absolute purity. He doesn't act to get anything. Indeed, his action is the opposite of caring for the fruits of action. All of his actions are motivated only by love. So thus, he's unaffected by actions. He's unaffected by the fruits of actions. And then finally, or the latent impressions that cause such actions. In other words, for those individuals who are in illusion, why do they act to begin with? Why do they do things? Why do they act in any way? Why do they think the way they do? Why do they speak the way they do? Why do they do the way that they do? Well, the reason why is because certainly they have desires, but more, they also have latent impressions. In other words, due to many lifetimes of conditioning of the psyche, of the subtle psychophysical nature of the astral form, etc., etc., of the energetic self, etc., we have sanskaras. We have all of these latent impressions that then cause us to act in a certain way. So this is sometimes called the subconscious. There's so many different terms for this in accordance with what school you're listening to, either Eastern or Western, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, etc. But we know that people are motivated very often by ideas, by impressions that are there below the surface. So this is understood very, very well by Patanjali and by yoga psychology. So with that understanding now of what is meant by latent impressions, what Patanjali is saying here is that God is motivated by no such thing. God doesn't have latent impressions. God is not divided, but rather God is a unitary being. That being the case, it is not even possible for God to be motivated in his actions by subconscious latent impressions. It's not a possibility because, again, God is ekam, God is one. This being the case, again, God is unlike any of us. God is, you are not God. We are not God. God is special. God is distinct. God is different from us. At the same time, God interpenetrates our very own reality. God is the soul of our soul. God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. But again, never make the mistake of thinking that we are God, because Patanjali will disagree. But then he goes on. We go to the next sutra now, which is, again, Pada 1, Chapter 1, but now Sutra 25. And it proceeds in this way. The seed of omniscience in the Supreme Lord cannot be surpassed. Very nice. So now, again, sarvagya. Sarvagya means omniscience. So again, another definition of God given by Patanjali, in which it is very clear that God is indeed the supreme Atman, the Paramatman, that God is the supreme Purusha, Mahapurusha, that he is not exactly like us, but that he is supreme. We are not supreme. And here he gives more description of this. He says, the seed of omniscience. Let's stop there, first of all. Everyone has a seed of knowledge within them. Indeed, everyone has a seed of omniscience. In other words, and this is interesting, a lot of Vaishnavas may not be aware of this. Indeed, a lot of Gaudiya Vaishnavas have no clue about this, actually. Ramanuja was very clear in explaining this, actually, and all Sri Vaishnavas accept this, that one of the inherent attributes of the Atman, of the soul, is that we have natural inherent omniscience. We have the ability to know all. Of course, what now constrains that omniscience is false ego. What constrains that is being situated in a realm of space and time. So it's for this reason that our omniscience is constrained. And indeed, Ramanuja himself explains that it is upon liberation, not just as jivan mukta, in other words, not just as actual spiritual liberation, but still within this material world, but it is upon liberation from the body as well, that those constraints are gone, and now we are all knowing. So thus we all have that seed of omniscience within us, even limited Atmans. But now again this distinction is made here, and that is that the Supreme Lord, of course, also has omniscience, sarvagya. However, his omniscience is not like our omniscience. His omniscience is unsurpassed. In other words, it is of the nature truly of infinity. It is something that is inconceivable to us, even though we also have omniscience. With our omniscience, envision this, imagine this. This is what is being said in this sutra, what I'm about to tell you. Even given our omniscience, which means all-knowingness, our omniscience is not strong enough to understand the nature of God. And God's omniscience is inconceivable even to us as omniscient beings. This is what is being said by this verse, something that I myself have told people for years and years and years, that indeed, just like there are different kinds of infinity, there are different kinds of omniscience, etc. So we also have omniscience, and our omniscience is infinitesimal in comparison to God's omniscience. So thus, with this omniscience, the Supreme Lord cannot be surpassed. Now let's go on. We have only 2 more verses to do, and then I would like to leave some time for questions and answers. Now we'll go on to Sutra 26, and it proceeds in this way. That Supreme Lord is the original Guru of all previous Gurus, because he is not conditioned by time. Let me tell you, actually, interestingly, any one of these verses that we've done today, easily we could have spent 1 hour on each of these verses, very easily. That would have been a summary, actually. But this is another one of these verses. So first of all, that Supreme Lord is the original Guru. This is, of course, an epistemological statement. What this is saying is that, first, the Supreme Lord is the source of all knowledge. How do we know? How do we know things? How do we know the Vedic scriptures? How do we know ourselves? How do we know what is the right thing to do, to not do, etc., etc.? Well, if we are very fortunate, extremely fortunate, we have a guru. I was the most fortunate person that I had several gurus who were all authentic and true liberated beings. If we can have one guru who is such a being, we are the most fortunate person on earth. But this is how we know, is through the grace of Guru and the teachings of Guru. But interestingly here, it's being said that the Supreme Lord is the original Guru, which, of course, makes absolute sense. Truth being of its nature, it has to be the case that truth originates first and foremost from God. And the proper understanding of that truth also proceeds necessarily from God, God being the source of all truth. You want to know truth? Where do you go? People who have truth. Who has truth more than anyone? That being who is the source of all truth, which is God. That being the case both here, but interestingly, there are other Vedic scriptures, including Bhagavad Gita and other places, that confirm this precisely, that God is indeed Adi Guru. That's the actual term. Adi means the original, the first, Adi Guru. That God is that first being who teaches other beings in order to help enlighten them. Indeed, within this material world, within the material context, it is Lord Brahma who is the first Shishya, who is the first student. And it is indeed Narayana himself who is the first guru. So now with this understanding, let's go on. That Supreme Lord is the original guru of all previous gurus. Now this also is of importance. Again, a person can very easily just read this and zoom right by it without understanding why Patanjali is saying this. The reason why this is of such importance is because A, certainly it is of great importance to have our own individual guru, that is that one person who is there before us, informed in one specific form, who we can learn from, who we can ask questions from, etc. But in addition to this, a guru does not stand alone. A guru does not stand in isolation, but rather a guru stands in parampara. That is, in the succession of guru, the lineage of gurus, going back, stretching back, ideally, quite literally, to the very beginning of time. So this is the power of the guru, that A, they themselves, as an individual person, yes, they have truth, they personify truth, absolutely. But more, they have backing. They have backup. They have their guru. And that guru has their guru, and that guru has their guru, stretching back quite literally to the beginning of time. So thus, with this statement, what Patanjali is pointing to is A, parampara, but B, also the idea that, again, the guru does not stand in isolation. So thus, let's go on. That Supreme Lord is the original guru of all previous gurus. Think of the most famous gurus. And this is the term, is previous gurus. Purva is the word that's used in Sanskrit, meaning previously. So think of any famous guru from the past. Think of any guru who lived 500 years ago, who lived 1,000 years ago. Gurus who are quite literally written of in the Vedic scriptures. And the Supreme Lord is really, ultimately, the guru of even those gurus. He is the King of Kings. He is the guru of all gurus. And why? Because he is not conditioned by time. This is why. Because he is not conditioned by time. We strive to not be conditioned by time ourselves. And why is this the case? This is the case because time is limiting. It's the case because space is limiting. Causality is limiting. The transcendent realm, the spiritual realm, is beyond time. It's beyond space. It's beyond causality, etc. It's beyond many other things as well. And this being the case, it is our goal to also transcend time. Well, this is the nature of God, is that unlike ourselves, where we find ourselves within this material world, we are conditioned by time. God is not. God is eternal. God is ever present. God is always, always, always enlightened. And when it comes to parampara, God also, being unconditioned by time, is ever present within the parampara. Let's go on to the very last of these verses, and this is verse 27. And it proceeds in this way. He is designated by pranava, by the syllable Om. Very nice. And this really ends this section in the Yoga Sutras where Patanjali talks very specifically about the nature of God. Now he ends with this very interesting note. Tasya vachakaha pranavaha. This is how he ends. That is 27. He, that is the Supreme Lord, is designated by the syllable Om. Pranava. Pranava is the word that's used, meaning the syllable Om. Now, why does he end in this way? Well, first of all, he explains what is the nature of God. He explains that indeed you're not God, I'm not God, that God is a distinct Atman, that God does not fall into illusion. You're an illusion. God is not an illusion. He never falls into illusion, etc., etc., everything we just spoke about. But now he says something else. First of all, he explains how God is known, God is designated via this divine syllable, Om. And this is telling us two things. First, it's a continuation of explaining what is the nature of God, because as we've seen before, this Om is not just anything, it's designating a very specific thing, and that is the omnipresence of God. So this is another of the qualities of God that Patanjali is explaining, a quality that God has and we don't. We are not omnipresent. You're not omnipresent. You are where you are right now. Let's say you're in America like I am. You're not also in Japan. Or let's say you're in Japan. You're not also in Germany, and on and on and on. We are not omnipresent, but God is. So this is the first thing that's being pointed to here. But then the second topic of importance with this sutra is that this also is how we know God. So God, now having been explained by Patanjali, this is how we know God, is by pranava, is by the syllable Om. That is by meditating upon divine mantra. And I've said this many, many times before, actually, but it bears repeating now. First of all, this is a sutra. That being the case, sutras necessarily are terse. They are not wordy. So thus, Om is code both for itself, that is actual pranava, but also for any divine mantra that contains within it the names of God that is revealed in the Vedic scriptures. So thus, Om Namo Narayanaya, for example. So thus, when you see this, don't limit what Patanjali is saying here only to Om per se, but again, any divine mantra that contains Om within it. So Patanjali ends by explaining to us, this being who I have just explained to you, who you are to have devotion toward, this is how you know him, by meditating upon his divine names. Not just chanting like a parrot, meditating upon his divine names. In other words, having so much devotion, so much respect, so much awe and reverence for his divine names, to the point where you focus all of your meditative awareness only on the sound vibration of those names. This is why when I speak about, let's say, recitation of mantra, you will notice I almost never say, oh, chant a mantra. A parrot can chant. No, we don't chant mantras. We meditate upon mantras. We give the mantra our full attention. So this is the process by which indeed we know this Ishvara, this Supreme Lord, according to Patanjali. So that being the case, I thank you very much for listening to my discourse on the God of Patanjali. And now, if anyone has any questions about Sanatana Dharma, I will encourage you to please ask your questions. We have a little bit of time, not much unfortunately, but we do have a little bit. Here, right off the bat, is a nice question by Varsaga, and I've answered this for a few people, but mostly in person actually. And I think it's nice that I also answer this publicly. And the question is, Namaste, how do we interpret dreams we have about God, Guru, or other divine beings? When we have such dreams very specifically, when we have dreams about God, and God meaning what? Not, some amorphous energy floating around like the Force in Star Wars, but no, when very specifically we have a dream and Krishna is there, or Narayana himself is there, Sriman Narayana, Lakshmi Narayana. When we see any of the actual forms of God, and we see these forms in motion, and we are even interacting with these forms of God, yes, that is something that we are to take very, very seriously. But before I explain how and why, let me go on. This is the nature of Guru as well. When you have a dream about Guru, you are to take it very seriously. And then you mentioned other divine beings. Yes, if they are truly divine beings, very, very elevated devas, devis, etc., yes, these are dreams that we have to take very seriously. And the reason why is because something of great profundity is being communicated to us. Now, what does it mean to take these dreams seriously? And you ask about interpreting such dreams. When it comes to interpreting such dreams, we want to be a little bit careful in the same way that we want to be careful in interpreting anything, interpreting the Vedic scriptures, interpreting the words of, let's say, some great Acharya who lived hundreds of years ago, etc. We want to be very careful as far as interpreting such dreams as well. Rather, the very best thing to do is, and this is what I do because I have such dreams a lot, what you do is when you wake up, first of all, allow yourself in a very calm state to not quite leave the dream, but to almost still be there and remember as much of it as you can as if you're still there. So that's the first thing, is you remember it. The second thing is you still yourself, and in a very humble mood, you ask the Guru, you ask God, you ask whoever you dreamt of, very humbly, to please communicate to me what it is that you wish to communicate to me. And then at that point, again, you don't interpret, rather you allow the meaning to come to you. And the meaning may or may not come to you immediately. It may not come to you for a month, but it certainly will in time come to you if you approach these dreams in that very humble sort of way. And just opening yourself to God, allowing God to communicate to you. And indeed, this is why I talked about interpreting so much. No, we want to avoid having our own mental speculation be there between God and us. No, we want to get rid of that. Just allow God to communicate to you. And again, it may be that very morning, or it may take a little bit of time. But just open yourself to what God is telling you, what the Guru is telling you, whatever divine being is telling you when you have such a dream. We only have about 4 minutes left, so earlier than usual, I'm going to sadly be kind of skipping and looking at all the various questions and seeing if there are a few questions that we have time for. So please forgive me if I am skipping your question. It's just due to time. Very good. Here is an interesting question. There are a lot of philosophical questions here. And as people know, I love to answer philosophical questions. But when there's one that's a little bit less philosophical but interesting, I like to hone in on those as well. And this is the question from Julia. Namaste, Acharyaji. Why did you choose to live in Nebraska? Is the Midwest more conducive to meditation? Very, very nice question. And as soon as I saw this, I just felt inspired to answer this, actually. Generally speaking, yes, the Midwest is more conducive to not only meditation, but spiritual life. Indeed, the reason, there's some people out there may think that's a somewhat strange or controversial answer. No, I can explain this for hours, actually. Our environment is crucial as far as making spiritual progress. And people who say that that's not the case really don't know what they're talking about. You know, the Vedic scriptures make it very clear to us that you want to find as sattvic an environment as you can if you want to make serious spiritual progress, real and legitimate spiritual progress. The Vedic scriptures are very clear about this. So I'll be very blunt. To live in Brooklyn, New York, which is where I was born and raised, and to try to be a yogi and to do meditation and to find inner peace, etc., versus living on farmland somewhere in the quiet Midwest. Oh, you're going to be successful infinitely so, more so, in the Midwest on a farm versus in Brooklyn. Yes. Yes, there's no way around this. It's not a matter of, prejudice against Brooklyn. No, it's simply a stark empirical matter of One is more conducive for mental and every other form of peace. One is not. So that being the case, the Midwest, very generally speaking, and not by a lot, but a little bit, is more sattvic than East Coast, West Coast. And I've been everywhere in America. I've lived on the West Coast. I've lived on the East Coast. I've lived many other places in between. And what I've seen is that, again, very generally speaking, the people in the Midwest are a little bit kinder. They're more earnest, etc. Life is a little bit quieter here, a little bit slower. Indeed, this is why the demonic beings call the Midwest flyover country. It's too boring for them. Doesn't offer them the titillation and excitement that they are accustomed to. So this is why truly demonic people who live on the East Coast, West Coast, they call the Midwest flyover country because it doesn't even exist for them. Well, we're fine with that. Please fly over and keep going. Don't stop here. Because here we're busy milking our cows and meditating. So that's why I'm in Nebraska, but there are many, many other reasons as well. And let me just say, at this point, we have to kind of end on that question because we have 60 seconds. Let me just say, another reason why I wanted to answer this question specifically is because, as people know, we have something that is the International Sanatana Dharma Society. We have something called the Vedic Heartland Initiative, where indeed we are encouraging people to move to Nebraska, to the area of West Omaha and further west from there, very specifically in order to be in a place that is conducive for making serious spiritual progress. We are creating a community here. We call it the Vedic Heartland. And it is centered around this beautiful place, our temple. And we already have had people who have moved here. We expect many, many more people to move here. And precisely because this is a place where, compared to massive cities, everything here is livable. Everything here is wonderful. Of course, no place is perfect. There's crime here. There are problems like anywhere else. But not like New York, not like Chicago, not like Houston, not like other places. Indeed, this is a very peaceful place, conducive to making spiritual progress. So I would encourage very serious members of the ISDS, of the International Sanatana Dharma Society, who are sincere, who are practicing Sanatana Dharma, and who are not necessarily tied to living where you are presently living. If you would like to join us in this initiative of starting a truly wonderful, authentic, well-functioning, and healthy Vedic community, please consider coming here. Again, only if you don't have any ties keeping you where you are. We never do anything in any sort of fanatical way and just encourage people, you guys run here regardless of anything. Leave your family behind. No, that's a cult. We don't do things in that sort of way. Only if you are not tied down, and if you would like to consider moving to our Vedic community, please do so. For more information on that, in fact, if you look at our videos, there is a video called the Vedic Heartland Initiative, where I explain all the details very, very deeply. So indeed, Julia, if you want to live in a place that is more conducive to meditation, and again, if you're not severely tied down to where you're living, please consider moving here to Omaha and living near our temple. And I guarantee you the quality of your meditation will be revolutionized in every way. So with that, again, I apologize I wasn't able to get to too many questions today. We'll see what happens next week. Hopefully we'll have more time. With that, I thank you all very much for being here as always. I ask you to please join us again next Monday. Please visit dharmacentral.com whenever you can and look at all the many things we have there. We have all of our books available there for sale. We have a beautiful mantra meditation album as well that's available. We have many, many different resources if you want to learn more about Sanatana Dharma. We have an email list if you would like to join that and receive more information about both the International Sanatana Dharma Society, but also the Vedic tradition in general. Also, if you would like to become a tithing member of the International Sanatana Dharma Society, you can do that on there as well, on dharmacentral.com. So with that, thank you again very much for being here, and namaste. Jaya Shriman Narayana. Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna. Jaya Shri Guru. Sanatana Dharma Jayate. Dharma Rashtra Jayate. Vedic Heartland Jayate. International Sanatana Dharma Society Jayate. Suryavansha Jayate. Om Hri Om. And with that, everyone, until the next time that we get together, please take very good care of yourselves in every way.